Hi everyone, welcome to the midday session, Archiving Your Assets. Effectively the session is split into sort of three presenters, if you like, or three speakers. There's myself, Graham from Route 6, which is sort of kicking the session off. Then I'll be handing over to sort of Mark from Object Matrix, and then finally Tridib from Storage DNA. So really, what we hope this will be is a fairly enlightening session. I hope there'll be sort of many of you to whom nothing that I really will say would be anything new, but hopefully it's sort of really just to sort of stimulate discussion and to kind of really kick off some points and sort of as we go on this sort of journey, if you like. So really, in terms of sort of the discussion and understanding archiving and backup, one of the first distinctions to sort of really make that the backup and archiving are two very different activities. We sort of really consider backup to be a short-term operation, if you like, which in essence allows you to sort of recover material or data or content in production to allow your production to continue. Archiving is typically a far longer-term exercise and enterprise. And really, when we talk about sort of archiving being a managed solution, typically that will encompass some sort of management or database or layer of intelligence over the operation. So the distinction is kind of important because a lot of the time, and everyone has been guilty of this, including myself, it's very easy to kind of lump these sort of two activities sort of, just into one. Also, I guess the distinction is sort of fair to make that when we sort of talk about archiving itself, one refers to sort of, in many respects, keeping the original content in its original form. So we'll look at that a little bit in closer detail a little later on. So typically, as we can see, the whole process of archiving itself and or backup really is an operation and a focus that's been sort of brought from the dusty back room, if you like, to the forefront of our sort of processes and workflows today. Prior to file-based acquisition, the whole notion of backup and or archiving were processes that were really sort of consigned to sort of very low level activities. They were things that sort of people thought about as an afterthought. They were not a priority at all. Whereas nowadays, with file-based acquisition, with the sort of the primary content coming off the camera in the form of a file, for example, on a set, with that shot costing sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce, the imperative on keeping that material safe, keeping the integrity of that content intact is really at the forefront of what we should be thinking about. And really, when we're thinking about archiving and backup itself, and sort of really more archiving in this sense, we need to think about the entire workflow from the beginning, not just as an afterthought sort of at the end of the process. So really, in terms of sort of proceeding with this and wanting to embark on this enterprise, what really are our options? Where do we sort of go in terms of sort of dealing with this problem? Well, a lot of the time, if we sort of think about the sort of the raw mechanics, our options in terms of storing this stuff are sort of pretty limited to sort of drives, tape, and disk arrays, etc., etc. But more importantly, in terms of thinking about this, the mantra or the motto that we should really think about or employ is: if we don't have 3 copies perhaps on different media types in at least 2 different places, then we don't really have it at all. Or we should prepare to be exposed to the fact that we don't really have it at all. That's really should be our guiding principle here, because effectively that safeguard of putting it on different formats of media type, of putting it in different places so that you have recourse to recovery in the event of a disaster of some kind. Unless we take those steps, unless we separate the material out into sort of primary and secondary sort of source locations, we are potentially exposed to problems of not being able to recover that stuff when we sort of need it. But the reality of the sort of, the 3 copies mantra, it's sort of all very well for me to sort of stand here proselytizing about sort of how important it is to have those 3 copies. But really, The reality of it, perhaps, is the fact that for most of us in the room and in sort of day-to-day operations, the reality is that we may only sort of really be able to sort of perhaps go for 2. And if we sort of think about that, what that really means is that we'll have our production copy and then we'll have at least 2 other copies. So I guess what we're sort of really saying is that if nothing else, instead of employing the sort of the 3 copies mantra, perhaps 2 at a push, and the one that you're using is really the least that we should be trying to kind of get away with. And we would sort of certainly sort of support the fact that if you've at least got that, you're as covered as you can sort of realistically be under most circumstances. So the difficulty is kind of, what are your options? How do you go? Where do you go with this? Because it's all very well, and we have a sort of, many clients, and often including ourselves historically, that have thought, well, I've got a RAID array, I've got sort of protection in my RAID, that's going to be fine. And the number of people that sort of really consider their RAID array to be a safe repository for their material is quite frightening, because essentially, when I first sort of started seeing clients losing drives during a RAID replacement operation, I thought initially that they were being unlucky. I subsequently learned that actually it's not unlucky at all. It's more common than you can imagine. So during RAID operations, if you are going to go for RAID, we would strongly urge that you sort of don't just go for RAID 5, go for RAID 6. You only sort of pay a 5 to 10% performance tax for going RAID 6, but you sort of up your redundancy sort of, enormously. And don't rely on RAID or RAIDed drives or RAIDed standalone storage as a repository for your stuff. RAID should just always be considered as a production cache, as your work in progress storage, as your fast premium storage that you use and then get material off. So the other sort of approach with this, and again, we're just sort of putting points out there to sort of think about and discuss, but you can't think about a backup and archiving sort of plan without thinking of what your strategy is in the longer term. You really need a beginning to end approach. And it's interesting, we were sort of, you see new cameras coming along all the time from various manufacturers, and people and sort of DOPs, photographers, production people tend to look at the camera in terms of, what its resolution is, what its characteristics are, etc., etc. But no camera or any type should be looked at without considering what its workflow is. And given the fact that you can sort of really, on most file-based sort of acquisition sources today, manage the control of the quality, the color management, the look, right through to the end. Given the fact that you can control everything in the file-based world from the beginning through to the end, your workflow should match that approach. You should think about managing your files and managing your data at the same time as you think about managing the look and the approach. So in terms of thinking about what that strategy is, in terms of considering how you approach this, you really got to think about, in terms of that work stream, making sure that there are sort of checks and balances along the way. You can't simply say, well, I'm going to sort of drag and drop some stuff onto this storage location or onto that tape and just assume that it's okay. You need to deploy software that'll basically do checksumming, that'll do verification checks, that will make sure that the veracity of that material is absolutely 100% and that you're good to go. And again, don't rely on the human factor. You need to sort of, on software alone rather, you need to make sure that spot checking that your material is good, making sure that you have integrity, because unless you sort of constantly checking your route and your sort of archiving or backup pipeline, you'll never know that you've got a problem until it's potentially too late. So it's always kind of making sure that you have steps and checksums in there to kind of really make sure that what you're putting away is to be kind of is good to go. So further, in terms of the options that we're sort of presenting, you're going to see a bunch of folks talking about sort of LTFS as a possible route to an archive and backup repository. And what we've sort of really seen again is that manufacturers and sort of have been slightly sort of disingenuous about LTFS in terms of saying, well, hey, it's tape and it behaves like disc. All you need is a tape driver. You mount it on the tape, you drag it away, and sort of away you go. The truth is, this is not the case. It's tape, and it behaves in subtly different ways. It's not going to be, your experience with it is not going to be like it is on disc. And as a consequence, you need to sort of really look carefully at what solutions you deploy on this. And you'll also see with the options that various manufacturers have, you are always sort of making a trade-off against speed, cost, access, etc., etc. And it's a reality of choosing your route through this today. It's not necessarily a negative that comes with the sort of territory. So in terms of sort of, preparing for going forward, you'll see that sort of, in terms of tape solutions, manufacturers like Cache and Zen have taken different approaches to tape-based archive. And Trinity from Storage DNA will also sort of enlighten you on sort of the processes and approaches that he has in terms of sort of moving their solutions forward. But in terms of just sort of leaving you with sort of a final thought really before I hand over, is that one thing that sort of really stuck with me on this is that someone once told me that anyone can back up, but only a superhero can restore. And it really is about all of this backup and all of this work and all of the effort that you put into this enterprise is utterly pointless if you can't get your stuff back. That's the whole exercise. That's the whole point of this. So effectively, when you're planning what your repository of last resort is, you need to sort of think very carefully of how you kind of get there and the sort of the quality of that process. So really, on that note, I'm going to sort of hand over to Mark from Object Matrix.